Welcome to Business Beyond Borders, the go-to podcast for CPA firms seeking transformative insights. I'm your host, Laurence Whittam, and with each episode we'll uncover key insights, best practices, and invaluable resources tailored for CPAs. From trending strategies to diving deep into outsourcing and offshoring, our experts will help in all areas of your business. Welcome everyone back to Business Beyond Borders. Really appreciate you joining today for one of our mini-series topics, which we are going to focus a little bit on cultural differences today. So this is, again, just one of those areas that firms typically struggle with when it comes to working with an offshore provider, right? And now this could be an offshore provider who is working on an FTE basis. This could be on a project basis. And this could be you're doing a BOT or you're building your own captive model, right? Where these are going to be integrated team members of yours. But the biggest thing is the fear somewhat of the unknown of working with this new culture, right, that you're dealing with, whether it's in India, the Philippines, it could be in Pakistan, it could be in Europe, right, in some cases, or South America. So there's so many places, and each one of these areas has its own culture, right, that is not quite like the US's way of doing business, right? And I want to split up two ways that we look at culture here. So we have the personal religious culture of what it looks like in a specific country, right? And then you can break it down further into religions, which in some of these countries where we typically outsource to is a big factor in their cultural beliefs, right? And in the way that they operate from a lifestyle perspective. But then we have business culture, which also varies very drastically, but they're two very different things, right? So, and I'm not going to be too specific on the countries as such, but because otherwise we could be here all day. But again, I'm more than happy to answer cultural questions directly if you want to contact me about a very specific case scenario that you've got and want to dig into it, whether it's in India or the Philippines or Mexico, South America, South Africa, right? We can dig into those specific areas directly. So, but for this podcast, I want to talk a little bit about, just as a whole, what are some techniques and tactics we should be thinking about in the firm when we're looking to integrate properly and overcome some of these cultural barriers that more typically come up. Okay, so the first is implementing a buddy system, right? A buddy system allows us in a remote environment to be more mindful from a one-on-one perspective as to what's going on, right? And the idea of that buddy system is that people get more comfortable quicker talking to somebody at a very similar title or level of employment, but that has a bit more experience than us, right? Where we can lean on them for that resource, right? We can lean on them for some educational guidance, career guidance, right? We can really understand the nuances of the firm, right? And the way that you do work. And a great way of doing that buddy system is because now we have a lot of these cultures work better when it comes to feedback and training in a one-on-one environment. They tend to struggle to open up as quickly when it comes to group settings. So by setting up this buddy system, it will allow them to very quickly open up and ask those types of questions that maybe otherwise they'll go and they'll try and figure it out themselves and maybe not get the right solution, which then could annoy or aggravate your own team, right? Because you've already given them some training or you've given them some guidance, but you'd have preferred them coming and asking a question to get it resolved rather than necessarily doing something that's wrong, right? Or not doing something at all and not bringing anything up at all, right? Is a common way of it being done, right? Because you don't want to necessarily do things wrong in a lot of these cultures. and you don't feel comfortable bringing it up as a question for whatever reason to necessarily your partner or somebody at that level instead. And another reason why is because there are generally quite strong hierarchical systems, right? The titles are generally quite important in a lot of these cultures. So you don't want to necessarily make somebody senior of you or a partner, right, look bad by questioning the way that they are informing you to do something. Whereas in the US, and it still depends on the personality of a lot of people in a lot of cases, but in the US, I mean, I feel like a lot more people are very open to giving feedback and questioning certain ways of doing things and hey, can we do it this way instead, right? And I'm sure there are a lot of people that are listening that could be partners, managers, and they're like, yes, they ask and question too much of the way that we're asking them to do something, right? But this is where, generally speaking, a lot of the international teams will not question that in group settings, right? And even one-on-one, it takes a little bit of time. So having a buddy to go to will help with that. Having a buddy to go to will also really help with the one-on-one building relationships in a remote environment, okay? Which means we get to understand those personal and those religious cultures as well, which are maybe not as normal for us and are a little bit different than what we typically do, right? So it means that you sort of creating a bit of a shortcut to make sure that at least somebody in your firm is understanding what is going on, okay? Now, this still needs to be controlled and this still needs to be managed. We need to be proactive. We need to make sure that this is something that we are putting controls around, right? How often are they meeting? Right? What is the best way to reach out to them? So that you want to make sure it's not disrupting any work, right? But you also want to make sure it's not all business, right? It is having those personal connections, which is going to be valuable, right? To make sure that you are helping build retention techniques with your offshore team as well, helping bring them into the cultural integration in your firm, okay? And it's also where you'll be able to hear about, okay, this isn't a good way of necessarily building it the way that we're building it. There may be ways that our firm does stuff in the US that is really creating a bit of friction with our offshore team, right? So can we change the way we're doing things? And this is where firms need to be adaptable to that. And there may be nuances to the way that you do things in one office in the US to another, right? Same way, right? There are different cultures in different offices, right? If you go from the East Coast to the West Coast or down in the middle of the country as well, central, right? There are different requirements, different needs, different lifestyles people are having. So we need to be cognizant of that, right? And we need to and this buddy system will really help, okay? Training and workshops, okay? Now, I can give a very specific example of a conversation I had with a large firm recently who just started their offshoring journey, right? They really haven't had too much exposure to building an international team, but they're a top 100 firm, and they've already integrated 20 plus people with their back office, right? And this specific one is based in India. And what they started to do is they then created let's do a training session. They always do like internal trainings, internal webinars where they're doing educational training and or collaboration across to share news and things like that. Somewhat of it is more like an education, right? It's less like a town hall necessarily. It's more like let's do a bit of training in this fashion. And it's voluntary, right? It's up to the individuals as to who will come and sign up. One of the partners came to me and said, we actually just did a cultural training, right? Where we talked specifically, and we had one of the gentlemen that was part of the India team come in and on the webinar, talk about some of those factors, right, that we really need to consider when it comes to culture. It was the most well-attended webinar that they've done. So they normally have maybe 100, 150 people attending some of these ones. They had, I think he said 350 of their team members, right, joined because they were genuinely interested, right? They were genuinely excited to use their global office now. but they also want to learn about it because they personally don't want to say the wrong thing, right? They don't want to do the wrong thing. They want to have some understanding as to like why the team may be doing certain things in a certain way, right? Or not communicating in a certain fashion, which is very normal for us, right? So I would highly recommend conducting some training sessions internally, right? And vice versa, right? As you're bringing the team on, do cultural training in the reverse fashion, right? Make sure your global team understands the way that you work, why you work that way, and that the reason why you're doing it is because you want maybe openness, you want direct communication. You would much prefer them reaching out by phone to you, and there is going to be no repercussions around that, right? Of like you questioning something, right? It may not mean that it changes immediately, right? They may make a mistake. You may make mistakes as you're doing it, but having a basis and like create somewhat of a cheat sheet around those types of factors as well. But it will help create expectations better internally, and it will give people some guidance as to how and why things are being done in certain fashions. Okay. There are different strategies you can use, right? You may want to just focus internally, right? In terms of you may have some of your global team doing internal presentations, right? Building them into that fashion. You may want to hire an external expert, right? In the cultural side of things. Your HR team may be very happy doing that, right? From their side, but maybe not feel as comfortable, right? If they're not as used to the culture where they're working, right? Or where you're growing your global team. Okay. If you're working with an outsourcing provider, you may be able to leverage them to use that, right? So that may mean, hey, I'm working on an FTE basis or I'm working on a project basis, but we really want to understand why we're getting these results, right? Why we don't have this level of communication, or why they're communicating after the fact rather than, or writing this out in this certain fashion, rather than just giving us a call and fixing the problem as it comes up. Okay, so talk to them, right? And in a lot of cases, those outsourcing firms, if you ask them to do it, they will have resources who are more than happy to sort of talk about it, right? The managers there, the VPs, the AVPs, right? They've got management resources who can come and have those conversations with your firm, right? However, in a lot of cases, we tend not to work with our outsourcing providers when it comes to that in that fashion, right? We like and we tend to do it ourselves rather than embracing that. But this also helps the outsourcing firm have a different focus and approach with you compared to every conversation they have with you when it comes to outside of those resources who are working for you, tends to be more on how can we expand, right? How can we add more FTEs to the relationship? How can we keep growing, right? How do we get more business from you, right? By embracing and bringing them into these other conversations, right, they'll see where those challenges are and what they need to do to fix them in order to continue to grow, right? Leverage them for that, right? You may also feel that, especially if you're hiring staff from an outsourcing firm, right, or staff level of less experience, they may not be comfortable getting up and presenting to you on those types of things themselves, right? So being able to use the outsourcing vendors for that resource is a great thing, right? So highly recommend, right? If you are having cultural problems or you are having problems and you feel like they're cultural problems, if you feel like you just don't know, reach out, right? Have a conversation with your vendor, right? Have a conversation with your more senior team members from the offshore side of things, right? See if you can build some training, some small workshops, some round tables, right? Internally, right? You may be able to leverage some of the community, like if you've got an international alliance you're working with, right? And that you're a member of, maybe they have resources you can go to, right? You can come to me and we can have those conversations, right? But it's, again, it's just something that you need to focus on. This is a common challenge. And a lot of the challenge, again, stems down to a lack of education around it, right? It's don't think it's a normal thing, right? It's a very normal, don't think about it being like out of the world. Like a lot of firms are going through the same challenge, right? So, and it's more about it not being super complex of a problem to overcome, but it is a challenge we need to be mindful of, right? And we need to be very mindful of how do we build and integrate this new culture into our firm, right? And it needs to be the same way, right? Even if you're using domestic team members who are contractors, right? Maybe working on a fractional perspective with you. It's not necessarily like their personal culture is going to be different, but now the way that they work from a business side of things will be, right? Especially if they're fractional, right? I mean, they may have other employments, right? They may be working fractionally for other firms. They may be working fractionally for an organization, right? They may only have certain timings that they're available to you, right? So the way that we have to work with people will change individually, right? But it just brings an extra nuance, right? When we're talking about internationally as well, okay? So really want you to have a think about that cultural side of things. Are you setting out different structures for doing so? Do you have somebody that is responsible for considering this side of things when it comes to you working with your global teams? I really think that if this is one of your big problems, right, one of the things that you believe is a bit of a boundary to you really scaling and making your outsourced team effectively run, let's talk about it, right? Let's figure out how we can overcome those pieces. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Business Beyond Borders, and there's been a few areas there that you can work on when it comes to this challenge. And we look forward to seeing you on the next mini-series of Business Beyond Borders. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to Business Beyond Borders. I'm Laurence Whittam, and it's been a pleasure bringing you impactful insights tailored for the modern CPA firm. Remember, the world of accounting is vast and ever-evolving, and we're here to navigate it together. For more resources and episodes, don't forget to subscribe and reach out to our experts. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of your business and explore the limitless possibilities beyond borders.